Many of you know that here in Lynbrook we have a village historian. His name is Dr. Mattson, and he has agreed to tell us a little bit about his books and his process as historian. Thank you very much, Art, for taking the time to talk to us.
Oh, my pleasure. I've been the historian of Lynbrook for over 30 years, starting with the 75th anniversary of the village when I served on the Lynbrook Historical Committee. The sad thing I discovered was that most people thought that the village was founded in 1911. There was no historian for the village to go back any further. And so I was puzzled, knowing that this area of Long Island had been settled much before that. In fact, there's a monument and there are tombstones in our cemetery that go back to the early 1800s at least. So why was nothing ever written much about the prior history? I was intrigued. And so I began to do research on my own for small articles I would write for the local paper. Eventually, I wrote enough articles using old newspapers on microfilm in the New York Public Library and at Hofstra University that someone said, why don't you put your articles together and write a book? And so I did, and that became the history of Lynbrook, which does go back to Native American times. And so many of the objects that I'm going to be talking to you about today are in the book and have the stories about them are there. And my interest in history expanded in a different direction at one point, which is to the cemetery, which I've helped put on the National Register of Historic Places. That's the Rockville Cemetery on Merrick Road. In there are the tombstones of the founding mothers and fathers of Lynbrook, East Rockaway, and Rockville Center, and also a monument to the 139 people that perished in two shipwrecks off the southern coast of Long Island. And so I wrote a book about that called Water and Ice, the tragic wrecks of the Bristol and Mexico on the south shore of Long Island. So why exactly I became so compelled to uncover these stories that have been lost, forgotten for decades, I can't really say. But history is compelling. And the more you dig into it, the more you want to find out. It just feeds on itself. There were times when I would be in a place like Liverpool, where one of the ships left that then wrecked off Long Beach. And I would come up with on microfilm a document from 1836 that showed the sailing notice for that very ship that resulted in that monument being built. The hair would stand up on the back of my neck. It's just unbelievable what the feeling is to discover these things from lost history, and then to be able to bring it to the public by way of a book, by way of TV shows like this, by way of a collection here that I hope some of you people may come and ask me to show them to you personally. It's a compulsion, I guess you might say. I pulled out from the collection several items of, I'm sure, interest to a lot of Lynbrook residents. They go from the oldest object, which is a knife, actually. It's a stone tool used by the Paleolithic Native Americans who occupied this area, the Lenape Indians. I brought this stone tool. By the way, this was donated by a Lynbrook resident named Al Leone. All of these items have been donated by Lynbrook residents, and when I know who did, I'll let you know. But this is really something, because it's certainly by far the oldest object we have here, coming certainly from before 1700, or could perhaps have been much earlier. It was found in a backyard on Union Avenue. And Al, when he picked it up, he just felt that when he put it into his hand, It just felt like a tool. And so I brought the object down to Adelphi University, to a professor of archaeology. He examined it very carefully and he came up with some really fascinating conclusions. He said, not only is this a tool, this is probably once was owned by a right-handed Rachquaake Indian, Native American. Well, I'm puzzled how he could know that, but he could see that by the wear mark on it, that it was a right-handed person that was using it rather than a left-handed person. And he knew that it would be probably a woman because he said this, because where it was found was in a midden of clamshells. This was below ground, what once was a well. Probably, actually, the water table was very high back then. And so one did not have to dig very deep, only perhaps 10 feet down to get to water. And there were clamshells in there, lots of clamshells all around, which had been harvested from Hewlett Bay. And this was an object used to pry open the clamshells. And so if you get a chance to come down here with me and put this in your hand and feel something hundreds and hundreds of years old from this area, it's quite a treat just to touch this thing. It's just great.
Jarvis U. Pearsall.
Yeah.
Of Long Island.
Yeah.
What's this sign?
Okay. Well, a lot of you viewers know that the older name of Lynbrook was Pearsall's, also called Pearsall's Corner. Before that, it had other names. The most common one, actually 10 names that have existed in history for this area. Near Rockaway was one of the older names. But the Pearsalls came up here, particularly Wright Pearsall, in the 1850s. There was only a very small settlement here called Bloomfield. He saw great possibilities for this area at the Five Corners. Great intersection of roads that went to Hempstead, to East Rockaway, to Jamaica, to Rockville Center, to Far Rockaway. He saw real great possibilities. So he began to buy up land at the Five Corners and then would sell it off to other people who also began to realize the potential. He founded a general store here, and the village grew rapidly from that point. So this sign was donated by the folks who were tearing down a building on Hempstead Avenue that had been owned at some point by Jarvis U. Pearsall. Now he's buried in the Rockville Cemetery on Merrick Road, and went to their cemetery records. Jarvis U. Pearsall lived from 1837 until 1898. So clearly the sign is from 1898 or prior. And so I'm sure he was proud that, in fact, we can say that this was from 1894 or prior, because it was 1894 that the name of Pearsall's became Lynbrook. So we can date this sign from prior to 1894, because we still have Pearsall's Long Island. Now, why the name change? Why Lynbrook? We were developing quite rapidly, the village was, and a lot of the farmers were desirous of selling their farms. Well, more than that, it was the real estate brokers convincing the farmers to subdivide the farms and sell off the land for development. But in the development schemes and paraphernalia and advertising that they were sending to Brooklyn particularly, of course Lynbrook is Brooklyn with syllables transposed, they wanted what one of the brokers called a more euphonious cognomen. That means a sweeter sounding name, to advertise the village to potential buyers who could commute to Brooklyn on the Long Island Railroad. And so several names were suggested. Windermere was one. Several others. So we want Bloomfield to come back. But this name was replaced by Lynbrook. And there's a funny way that happened. They had a vote, but the older residents, like I'm sure Jarvis U. Pearsall, refused to go to the vote. They wouldn't even bother to cast the vote. They said, this is the name of this village, and it's going to stay. Pearsall's Long Island. And so those who did show up to vote, voted for Lynbrook. Well, it is theoretically possible this hung even after that, because some people in this area continue to call the place Pearsall's for another decade. But there's a reason why the name stuck, the name of Lynbrook. And that is that one of the chief proponents for the name was a railroad agent for the Long Island Railroad. He changed the signs on the railroad. He changed it on the schedule because of this vote that had been taken. And so that forced the name Lynbrook to replace the name of Pearsall's Long Island. So that's this. I'm glad we have this piece. It's a great memory device.